Thank you. Just thinking about the title of this presentation, I wondered if perhaps in 10 years' time we might be thinking of Ireland as in some sense belonging to the Nordic family of countries. And that led me to think as well about Northern Ireland and Scotland as two small, open, regional economies with some remnants of decency from the British welfare state left. We're often told how much higher social welfare cash payments are here in the Republic than in Northern Ireland. But of course, we're not told that, or we're not reminded that when your child is sick, you pay 50 or 60 euro to the doctor if you're outside the exemption limits for the medical card. That must be fairly unique in Europe. I'm not sure if there are any other European countries in that situation. Just as a preliminary as well, I think it might be interesting to point out that we are being bailed out by Nordic countries. In the IMF, Troika, EU, ECB Memorandum of Understanding, you will see that two countries, Sweden and Denmark, are involved in bilateral loans. So within the 85 billion loan facility, Sweden is committed to 600 million euro and Denmark to 400 million euro. None of that has been drawn down yet. We also have a bilateral loan arrangement with the UK equal to 3.8 billion with an interest premium of 2.3%, which is being under negotiation at the moment. So I suspect that there may be Swedish and Danish banks with exposure to the Republic of Ireland economy, but an interesting point nonetheless. Just to set the scene in terms of where we're at in overall economic inequality and GDP per capita. Most recent data available there, taking 27 EU member states. You can imagine, if you look at this graph, inequality on the vertical axis and GDP per capita on the horizontal axis, you can see already a downward sloping line going through those data points. Way over to the right is Luxembourg. That's an unusual case always, I suppose. And Norway has a very high GDP per capita. Not unrelated, I suppose, to the discovery of oil off the coast of Norway and the way that a very hard deal was struck with the exploration and drilling companies. But anyway, you can see there that the Nordic countries tend to cluster together towards low inequality and high GDP per capita. Some of the key points I'd like to address in the next few moments is that investment in social infrastructure in all countries is vital to economic prosperity, social cohesion and well-being. Within that investment, education and lifelong learning is an important case, and I'd like to focus on that in the time available. Thirdly, that such investment has a payback socially, economically, personally. And finally, there seems to be a virtuous circle in terms of equality and overall level of social well-being and performance. This is noticeable in the area of health studies. Many of us will be familiar with the work of Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, who showed a relationship in the book, The Spirit Level, between the overall level of health and inequalities in different societies. That relationship seems to hold as well in relation to education and learning. How much is invested in education from public and private sources? So putting everything together, latest available data for 2008, you can see that the red bars for the Nordic countries at or above the OECD average, which is just over 6% of GDP. Ireland came in there at 5.5% of GDP in 2008, significantly up on previous years due to a contraction in GDP in 2008. In the future, you will see the figure for Ireland rising up to 6.5% because GDP collapsed in 2009 by 9%, and the education budget remained more or less steady and then declined in nominal terms in 2010. We may actually see education spending coming up to 7% of GDP by the year 2010, again as a result of the economic contraction. Clearly a lot of difference across countries there in terms of how much is invested. A big emphasis in investment from early childhood, from cradle to grave is the expression used in Scandinavia in terms of lifelong learning. That of course reflects also specifically the commitment that societies make to public provision, and much has been made of public expenditure so far in the discussion today. Let's have a look at the high spenders, those fiscally reckless countries: Denmark, France, Finland, Belgium, Sweden, Austria, Iceland. Norway actually is a bit of an outlier there. Now, have a look at that graph and tell me how many are in the dock, how many are frozen out of the bond markets at the moment, how many of them are subject to bailout assistance. And we, of course, are at about 46% of GDP at the moment. I've taken out the Anglo-Irish recapitalisation, which, if I added in, would bring Ireland up to 67% in the year 2010. Anglo-Irish has been to us what the collapse of the Soviet Union was to Finland in 1991. It took about 20% of our income out. Slight exaggeration, perhaps, but a huge impact, the collapse of the Soviet Union, along with the property bubble in Finland in the late 1980s. Now, we love the Nordic model in Ireland. There's cross-party, cross-social consensus that we want free health, we want free education, we want free fees at third level, we want universal medical cards for elderly people, and we want free preschool education. And we're immensely proud that we are a low-tax country. And we have to be fiscally solvent and consolidation by the year 2015 with 3% deficit as a proportion of GDP. That's what I think could be called the Irish riddle. Anyway, let's have a look at the revenue side. This shows total revenue as a proportion of GDP in 2010. Norway heads the league. That's including taxes and non-tax revenue, actually, so I suspect oil revenues must be lurking in there. And again, the Nordic countries are leading the pack there, and Ireland is way down at about 35%. Now, I'm sure someone in the audience is going to say, yeah, but you should be doing that relative to GNP. And my answer to that is, fair enough, take out corporate taxes, 3.5 billion. And the proportion is down again to the upper 30s. So you can't have it both ways if you want to talk about GNP versus GDP. Whatever way you measure it, we're a low-tax, low-revenue country. And that's our choice, politically. We weren't told to do this by any bad boys out there. We chose a low-tax model, and we're now choosing to reduce expenditure from 46% of GDP to 38% of GDP by 2015, and to increase revenue from about 35 to 37%. It's all in the Stability Programme update. So, following plans, we will be deviating from the EU average here towards the low revenue, low tax end of the European spectrum, further away from the EU average, not to mention Nordic levels. Okay, just to say something about education performance. Reference was made by our Finnish colleague to PISA and the performance in science, maths and reading at the age of 15, and of course Finland is a way out ahead. It's leading in reading literacy in all PISA surveys since they began in 2000, and the latest data is for 2009. The shock, of course, for Ireland is that we lost rank, particularly on reading. We're just about average now, actually, with the remaining Nordic countries there, which in turn cluster around the OECD average, the yellow piece there in the middle. It's well to remember that there is a huge emphasis on literacy and reading in Nordic countries. If you go there, everyone is reading, and there are books everywhere, and everyone, or almost everyone, speaks perfect English, from the shopkeeper to the taxi person. But it's interesting to understand the historical genesis of that. It's complex, it's sociological, it's cultural, it's possibly religious. It may be to do with the fact that in the paintings of the 17th and 16th century, mothers are reading the Bible to their children. And again, in that strand of Lutheranism, there's a huge emphasis on the right of passage at the age of 12 or 14 in confirmation. Again, heavy emphasis on reading literacy, even though Nordic countries are highly secular countries, as we are becoming. In relation to the overall relationship between socioeconomic inequality and performance in PISA, there is a data cloud which doesn't appear on this graph, but believe me, it's there, and the line slopes upwards in terms of the index of economic and social cultural status. The more equal societies are, the higher on average the performance in PISA. In terms, just to focus on some of the countries there, in fact, if you look at the proportion of variance in PISA results due to socioeconomic background, in other words, the percentage of difference in performance between schools and within schools, how much of that is associated with the socioeconomic background of parents and families we're talking here about 15-year-olds' performance in PISA. There's actually a large variance across Nordic countries, from Denmark, way over, with apparently higher levels of inequality, and Iceland at the other end of the spectrum. But again, Finland is a way out there for whatever reason. Study groups were sent up to Finland in the last decade to find out, and they said, well, gosh, we've no idea why we're doing so well. And there are obviously a range of issues, too detailed to go into here, but it does appear that a culture of egalitarianism on the whole is facilitating a higher performance across OECD countries, and Finland probably is one example of that. Yet another illustration of the point is the relationship between civic literacy at age 14 and performance in PISA, in this case mathematics. Again, you'll see the Nordic countries are congregating there towards the upper right-hand corner of the graph. In other words, the civic knowledge and dispositions of 14-year-olds in Scandinavian countries are well above the international average, and that is positively correlated with PISA results. During the immense tragedy in Norway last summer, it just struck me how high the political culture must be amongst young people in a country like Norway, that you can have a summer camp like that and discussions taking place about society and the future. Lifelong learning. And again, if you look at the international evidence on adult literacy, for example, countries again, particularly Sweden, are away towards the top. In terms of participation in education and training, whether formal, non-formal or informal, typically the Scandinavian countries are well above Ireland. There's a strong emphasis here in Ireland on initial education, hence the obsession with getting into third level and the points races and all this type of thing. And once you got into employment, there's much less emphasis about continuing education and upskilling relative to Scandinavian countries. Of course, it should be pointed out that the trade union movement in Scandinavia historically has played a major role in education, and thinking especially of the worker adult education circles, which are very numerous and popular in countries including Sweden. Okay, some of the key conclusions I'd like to draw from this is that globally countries differ a lot in regard to how much they invest in people and communities. It's clear that Nordic countries invest a lot in human capital. During the crisis of the 1990s, in Sweden, for example, there was an across-the-board cut in public expenditure. It was pretty blunt. It was more or less 10% on everything except research in third level. They figured that this is one area that we shouldn't cut. In Finland, again, there was a very severe contraction in the early 90s, up to the mid-90s especially, and it will be interesting to hear, what ring fencing took place at that time in regards to education and research. My impression is that it was one of the areas that perhaps was spared compared to other areas, and I think that's actually true. So there is, I think, perhaps a lesson for us there. The other conclusion is that having a highly skilled, knowledge-intensive society does facilitate economic and social development, not just economic growth in the narrow sense, but the wider economic and social development. I didn't illustrate, perhaps in detail, the returns to human capital investment, if you were to look at individual earnings in the labour market, what you would find actually is that the returns to human capital are quite low in the Scandinavian countries. And the reason essentially is that there is much wage compression. So the difference in earnings between a higher education graduate and someone who has dropped out before completion of upper secondary education is not that large. If you take it up to the social level, there is evidence that education and learning has contributed very much to economic growth. Long-term studies from the early 19th century up to 1970 in the case of Sweden has shown a link between macroeconomic growth and human capital. Studies by Asplund, for example, and others. It's less clear, perhaps, the evidence since the 1970s. I would think of human capital especially as a facilitating agent more than something that's causative. Just having a highly educated workforce or population doesn't necessarily give you economic development, but it is undoubtedly an essential condition and a facilitating factor in helping to bring that about. And then finally, there is a link, so it appears, between equality and the overall level of health, education and social cohesion. Again, the highest levels of social capital as measured by civic association, participation and voting are in the Scandinavian countries. So far from the state crowding out voluntary initiative, the highest levels of voluntary initiative are precisely in those states that have the highest level of public state involvement. Finally, one of my favourite charts. The question is really, what sort of an economy do we need for what sort of a society? And that really is the fundamental question, I think, that needs to be asked. And I don't think we should come away maybe from today's seminar thinking, well, you know, we've been actually bad. We took the Anglo-Saxon model and, you know, we're paying for it now, God knows. And the thing to do is to plug in the Nordic model. And, you know, the hills are very green, far away. I mean, let's not be naive. They have problems, and the welfare model is under enormous pressure. And there is enormous diversity across Scandinavian countries. But, you know, looking at it in the whole, I think it's not a bad model, and it's a hell of a lot better than what we've had, and it's a hell of a lot better than what passed for socialism in the Soviet Union and other states of a similar nature. Very finally, we recently had a new president elected here in this country, so I think we've more permission than ever to be imaginative and playful with words and to dream dreams. And I think we should link that to what I might call a Scandinavian pragmatism and hard-headedness. But also, and this is my final reflection, having honest civic conversations, really being honest with ourselves and each other and actually telling it as it is and how it could be. And that perhaps is the lesson we need to take from how things were done in Scandinavia. Thanks.